Let's pick up where we left off in the previous video, where we're going to return to painting on the body of this model. What I want to do at this point is go back to the layer panel and select the uppermost body layer, the one that had the green tint to it. And I'm just going to cycle through some of the different blending modes, just like you would in Photoshop. Creating this second copy of the layer is just something I wanted to experiment with. You may prefer not to do that. You may want to start with a base color. It just, again, it's a personal preference. I wanted to kind of play with the blending modes and see what looked best as a starting point. Just keep tweaking the opacity. Maybe try pin light blend mode. Modulate. I think I'll just go back to exclusion for now, and I'll hide the other parts just like we did previously. I'm going to skip forward just a few moments to where I'm actually going to paint the eye texture. In the E panel, I'll choose the polygonal lasso tool with ignore backfacing unchecked, so it will select all the way through the model. And I just noticed that the layer is in multiply mode, so when I go back to standard blend, it's much brighter, so I'm going to have to probably repaint this. At this point, I'm starting to realize that something's not quite working right, and I'm trying to diagnose what the problem is. So I'm looking around the UI, and I notice in the upper left-hand corner in the toolbar where it says invert tool action, that is checked. By default, it's unchecked. Because invert is going to do, as the name implies, it's going to do the reverse. At some juncture previously, I had checked that option, and I typically will use the control key, but sometimes if you're going to do a lot of repetition, checking invert tool action can be helpful, but you have to remember to uncheck it when you're done, or otherwise you'll run into situations like this. Another option that you may want to make sure you uncheck when you're done is using steady stroke, because oftentimes certain brushes or certain types of tools don't work properly with steady stroke turned on. Okay, so we're now ready to work on the veins of the eyeball here. So I just chose the appropriate brush alpha for this task. And I'm using the stamp draw mode in 3D Coat's E panel. This particular draw mode will allow you to click and drag to scale, while simultaneously you can rotate as you're dragging to change the orientation. So it's really nice for this very purpose, where you're creating a lot of randomization. I chose a different vein texture just to add a little bit more variation. And I'm just continuing to use the stamp draw mode. And one thing I would suggest when you're working in 3D Coat, you can always go a little bit on the high side whenever you're generating bump or color. You can go on the high side because you can always dial it back on your individual layer if you need. Just like in Photoshop, it's always easier to subtract something that you've already painted as opposed, or dial it back, as opposed to having to try and add it after the fact. So just using a regular brush here to kind of softly blend all that color in. Adjust the opacity a bit in the toolbar. using a white texture or a white color now. Now we're going to go ahead and add the iris. So to bring up a 2D image overlay, I've gone to the materials palette and I clicked new to bring in these individual textures. And when I click on the thumbnail, it's going to bring the overlay up in the viewport, and you'll have the preview options panel at the very top with different widgets allowing you to navigate, move, rotate, scale, and so on. And that's what I'm doing here. So I'm going to try and apply this in the 2D texture editor rather than in the 3D viewport. You can turn the wireframe on by clicking the wireframe button at the top of the editor. If you want to turn it off, just click it once more and it'll toggle it back off. So I'll crank my opacity up. And I also want to adjust the depth value downward because this is going to be just a very slight level of bump. Even 5 is probably a bit too much. So I'll undo. And I'll reduce that down to 1. That's about right. Even if you're on the high side, we can use the magnification and reduction brush to dial it back down locally where we brush, or use the erase brush. And that's what I'm going to do here. Just going to softly erase the edges. Adjust the eraser opacity. With the layer selected in the layer panel, I'll just reduce the depth level at the top of the panel. Now I'm going to go back to the surface materials panel and unhide the head just to kind of gauge how it's going to look, and I probably want to change the scale, so I'm going to redo this actually. Since I painted the iris on the very same layer as the rest of the eyeball texture, I had to undo several times, and I created a new layer just for the iris alone. So I'm going to replace it, and also going to use a different variation or a different image. So from the E panel, I'll choose the ellipse draw mode, and that way I can just click in the very center and drag just like you would in Photoshop. And I want a little bit further beyond the image itself where it has some white in the background, so I've got to redo this. Click and drag again. I'll go back to the surface materials panel and unhide the head once more. That appears to be much better. I should mention at this point that the paint room in 3D Coat does not handle transparency nearly as well as you might see in a 3D render inside of a 3D application. So it's hard to visualize here in the Paint workspace if you're trying to do it completely physically accurate, where you've got the inner part of the eyeball, maybe the sclera with the lens attached on the outer surface. So just trying to basically get as close as I can visually here in the Paint workspace. You'll notice that I went ahead and did the same thing as far as painting the iris on the rear eyeball. So now I'm going to go back to the regular eye layer and I'm going to apply some glossiness. What I did is enable just the glossiness or the specularity channel in the toolbar, and with a rectangular lasso draw mode I went ahead and just applied it to the entire group of eyes. So I'm just erasing some of that glossiness just in the very center where the pupil is at. And I want to show tools that you might typically use in order to copy textures from one side to the other. In this case, when I painted, I didn't have the symmetry plane enabled, and that will happen sometimes. So what we're going to do is use the clone stamp tool, just like we would use it in Photoshop. In the tool options panel, in this drop down, I'm going to choose symmetrical copy. Then I'll hit the S key to bring up the symmetry panel, and I'll choose the X axis. I'm going to turn off the symmetry plane visibility, but leave symmetry on. So all I have to do is paint the empty side, and it's going to copy from the other side. All right, I think we're done. So let's unhide the head once more, and we'll see how it looks. So I think we're ready to proceed now. We're going to pause the video right here. We're going to pick up in the next one where we're going to start painting inside the mouth and corrective textures on the surface of the body. So stay tuned. We'll see you then.